Hello, folks. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me. I'm just looking over my second screen, making sure I got everything working here. I'll go ahead and start in just a couple minutes. Just going to give folks a chance to join. Folks, I'm just making sure, never done this before, so just making sure all the streams and everything are working. I am live, live on Twitter, on YouTube, and on Twitch. Let me pause that. And I actually have it set up as well so that you can post responses in any of those places. So you can post a comment on Twitch, on YouTube, on Twitter, and I'll get that, and I will be able to respond, hopefully. Again, this is, like I said, my first time doing this, so if there are any issues, hopefully we'll get them worked out. So I'm just going to start in another minute or so. Love to have folks, if you are sitting on the stream waiting, I'd love to have you just put whichever place you are, who you are, and where you're from. I'd be really interested to hear that. Let me just do one thing. I'm just going to actually put this on my second screen. Oops, sorry about that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So just before we start, if folks would be so kind as to click this link, just arefortherestofus.com/survey. It will take you, I'll actually pop it up on the screen here as well. It'll redirect you to a Google form. It'll just ask you a few questions about your familiarity with R. So I'll just go ahead and fill out a few things. Actually, let me say I'm not at all familiar, Just making some stuff up here. I have a bachelor's degree. I put in my gender however I want to. I'll put in male. How old are you? I'm 15. Again, not exactly true. I'll put in Portland, Oregon. And I'm going to go ahead and submit that. So if you all could go ahead and do that as well. That would help me because I'm going to actually use some of the responses there for as part of the demonstration. And I'm just actually opening this up to make sure that I am seeing your responses. All right, great. I can see that the one has come in from me. So let me go ahead and get started. Again, just go to arefortherestofus.com/survey. So just in terms of logistics, put any questions in the chat. I'll stop if necessary. That can be, so I said chat, that's actually from a previous webinar I've done, either on Twitter, on YouTube, or on Twitch. All of those responses, I'm using a service called Restream. They'll all show up somewhere where I can see them. I'll have time for Q&A at the end if folks want to ask any questions. And just starting out, in terms of who am I? So I'm David. I'm the founder of Art for the Rest of Us. I started Art for the Rest of Us because I am not a hardcore quant, is kind of how I typically describe myself. I'm a PhD social scientist, but I'm an anthropologist, which, as you likely know, is a fairly qualitative degree. And I got into R a few years ago, really teaching myself. And I realized that there was a really strong need for education on R, but really pitched to people kind of like me, people who I had primarily used Excel before transitioning to R, and I wasn't interested in becoming a hardcore quant. I had some specific needs. For me, it was a lot about data visualization and some really kind of basic data analysis, things like descriptive stats, that type of thing that I wanted to do, and I thought R would be a good tool to use it, and it really has been. So I really want to then kind of offer the type of education that I wish I had had when I was learning R to other folks to help them learn R as well. So let's go ahead and talk about getting started with R, kind of what it looks like, how it works. Actually, sorry, let me just pop this up. Great. So first, let's start out by talking about what R is. When people talk about R, they're actually typically talking about a couple different things. So there is R, R itself, which you need in order to run R. When people typically say R, as I'll show you in just a second, they're actually typically talking about two pieces of software. But you do need R itself. So you go to what's called the Comprehensive R Archive Network, CRAN, find the version for your operating system and download it. So let me show you what it looks like here. So if I just open R, this is what it looks like. Pretty bare bones. You're working at the command line. It's pretty basic. And there are people who work with just R. I'm definitely not one of them, but you can. I mean, I can type, for example, 2 + 2, it returns 4. Obviously, you can do more complicated things than that. But the basic idea is that you put things in at the command line and get things back. I'm going to go ahead and quit that. So again, that's R itself. When people use R, the most common IDE, Integrated Development Environment, in other words, the kind of graphical user interface that people are typically using, is called RStudio. And the way to think about it, and I like this metaphor from the Modern Dive book, is that you think of R as being like the engine in a car, and RStudio is like a dashboard. So you can, you need the engine, of course, in order to push the car forward, but the dashboard really helps you to steer. So to download RStudio, you go to the RStudio website. There are a bunch of versions there. For most folks, the desktop version, which is the free version that people typically think about, is the one you need. Find the one for your operating system and download it. And when you work in RStudio, it's going to look more like this. And let me actually just flip over to my version of RStudio. You can see you have a number of panes here. So for example, if I look down here, you're going to see this right here, the console, is actually the same as what we saw when we were just working in R. So it basically kind of adds things on top of the console here. So for example, here I have some code that I can save that I'm working with. Here I have my environment, which is kind of typically data that I am able to work with within R. And then down here, RStudio has this concept of projects. So you work with a bunch of files that are all kind of in the same directory, and you have easy access to them working in a project here And down here, we actually see what all of these projects are. All these files in our project are. All right, I'm just checking one thing. All right, cool. Let me flip back here. So R works with the idea of packages. Within R itself, just kind of core R software, you can do a lot. I mean, I showed you, for example, working just in R, I could type 2 + 2 = 4. Of course, you can do much more than that. But I'd say the real power of R is how extensible it is. And you have all these extensions, which in R are known as packages that enable you to do specific things. So for example, the way to think about packages typically, and again, this is from the Modern Dive book, which is an excellent, excellent resource when you're getting started, is that R is like a new phone. It gives you that kind of core functionality when you get a new phone. But packages are like apps, so they allow you to do specific things. So say you want a Maps app or a podcast player app, you download the app that you need to do that. The equivalent with R is that, say you want a package that helps you to build maps or to do some different types of data analysis. There are going to be packages that will enable you to do that. So some examples of packages. I am a huge fan of what's known as the Tidyverse. It is actually a collection of packages. You can see here, this is actually a screenshot from the website. All the packages here share an underlying design philosophy, grammar, and data structure. Basically, to translate that to a slightly less technical language, what that means is they all kind of work in the same way. So if you learn to work with one package, it's going to be pretty consistent working with other packages. And it just makes learning to use each of these packages much, much simpler than other packages where the way that they work might vary from package to package. I'm also going to demonstrate a package called GenderCoder, which I have highlighted some of the kind of key aspects of it. I'm a social scientist, and one of the challenges that many of us in social science face is respecting the gender diversity of respondents. If you think of typical kind of ways that that's asked on surveys, it'll be things like, multiple choice where it's male, female, other. The GenderCoder package allows you to have folks just respond in an open-ended way. So if you did the survey, you will see that I actually asked you to do that in an open-ended way. I did not give you options. And you'll see that it'll then enable us to code these into responses. Sorry, just to kind of finish off on packages, they range from the really kind of broad, which Tidyverse is. It's a broad set of packages that enable you to do things like importing data, some kind of basic reshaping and basic analysis as well as data visualization, down to really kind of specific niche packages like GenderCoder that allow you to do things like simple recoding of free text gender responses. There are thousands and thousands of packages, which really, again, makes R super powerful. So why use R? I'm going to give you a few reasons that have been most powerful for me. First is that you can do data analysis in a snap. So I have up here data from what's called NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's just a brief snippet of the data. Whoopsie. Where did that go? Hold on, let me bring this over here. So in our studio here, I have NHANES. This is the data that I have imported. You can see it's 10,000 observations here, 22 variables. You can see this is the full data set here. Here is kind of a snippet, just kind of what shows up on the screen. And with R, you can write a few lines of code. So you write, for example, I have named this data frame that I'm working with NHANES. And then this funny little thing here is called the pipe, which basically it's a tidyverse element, and it allows you to kind of do multiple steps. So what's happening here in this code is it's saying, start with NHANES, then let's group by gender, let's drop any NAs for height, and then let's summarize to create a new variable called mean_height, which is the mean of the height variable. So I can quickly, in 4 lines of code, get the average height, the mean height for, in this case, it's just female and male are my 2 options in terms of gender. And I know, this isn't a tutorial in how to actually do the coding. This is really kind of conceptual. But I hope you can also see that the language of that the tidyverse uses is actually relatively comprehensible. The name of the function, so for example, group by, drop NA, summarize, actually are kind of like, they are English words, which is intentional and makes it, I think, a lot easier to learn, in addition to being really quick once you know the functions. You can also do really high quality data visualization. As I mentioned before, this was actually the reason why I initially wanted to learn R. So here, for example, are a bunch of data visualizations from the BBC that are all made in R, specifically the ggplot package. The BBC has also released a package called bbplot, which helps you if you want to make plots in the style of the BBC, which is pretty cool. This is an example of a spread from a report called Oregon by the Numbers that I worked on. I can actually continue to work on it. I may actually even do some live coding of it this afternoon. And all of these visualizations I made in R, specifically again with the ggplot package. So you can see I make a bunch of maps here as well. I made a population pyramid, some bar charts. All of these are made using ggplot. There are also some really interesting ggplot extensions which enable us to take the kind of core ggplot package and add on other types of visualizations. So for example, here is a ridgeline plot. There's a package called ggridges that I really like. It's a neat way to show kind of distribution. So this is actually demonstrating distribution of SAT scores. I do some work for a foundation here in Oregon, and it was looking at, I think it was math scores of applicants and recipients of a scholarship program. So for example, you can see in 2014, the distribution of the math SAT scores. For those outside the US, SAT is a test that folks take when applying to college. It's a college entrance exam. So you can see, for example, that in 2014, applicant scores overall were a bit lower, in the lower distribution than, for example, with recipients here. You can see the highest point is kind of between maybe like 550, whereas for applicants, the highest point, so the highest number of folks was a little bit, just about 500. R also opens up really unique reporting possibilities. This is an example of a Shiny dashboard that I was making. You can do interactive visualizations within R. So this was looking at early childhood resources in the state of Oregon. So you can see there are, for example, you can see daycare, preschools, and under that, so those are all the kind of dots that you'll see in just a second, or not, sorry, not the dots, the kind of red and green markers. Under that, you could, the dashboard was set up so that you could see kind of demographic data about the location of those childcare facilities. And this type of interactive where the user can kind of zoom in or filter, that type of thing, is totally possible within R, so you don't have to, for example, use Tableau for that if you learn to use, in this case, Shiny. Really, though, I think the killer feature of R is what's known as R Markdown. I didn't even know what R Markdown was when I started using R, but it's really been the feature that's totally transformed my work. To explain R Markdown, I like kind of giving an example of what I think of as a more typical workflow. So for example, say you're doing your analysis in SPSS, you get some data, you import it to SPSS, you do your analysis, then you spit out like a clean version of your data. You do that in Excel, you make some visualizations, you then copy those into Word, and then you write your report in Word, okay? You know, that probably works okay, but what happens if you are doing a survey, say that's your data that it's initially comes in, it's survey data, and then, oh, you get 5 more surveys. Well, then you have to go manually back to the beginning, do your analysis in SPSS, spit it back out to Excel, make your visualizations, back to R, do your reporting, and it can be really tedious. Not to mention, if you have to do this year after year, it's just a really tedious process if things go wrong in any way. R Markdown gets rid of this. So with R Markdown, you write kind of a combination of text and code, and then what you do is called knitting, which is just a funny way of saying you export. So for example, here on the left, you can see I was writing, doing some analysis about Douglas County in Oregon. Douglas County is a county in Oregon. So you can see it's got the text here, populations of Douglas County in Oregon are shown below, and then it's got some code. So when I knit it, so when I go from this R Markdown version to Word, what happens is this code gets converted, in this case, into a graph. And so I can do this at any point. And if I get new data, so if you, for example, you can see, and again, I know you're not going to necessarily understand the code, but just bear with me for a second. You can see it has a line here where it's reading in an Excel document. If I get new data, I simply update it so it points to the new data, or if I add the new data to this dc-data.xlsx document or spreadsheet, I simply rerun it, reknit it, and then it'll spit out the report with the updated results. I like this quote from Dana Wanzer, who says that when she uses R Markdown, all the work is done up front, and then every session, every time she needs a new report, she spends 15 minutes generating the report and sending it to her clients. So let's actually flip over for just a second. Gonna flip over to the data that we have. So I don't actually have that much data. Let me actually see if I can do one thing. If folks are watching and you could just go to that address really quick, it'll make the next little bit much more interesting. I can see we actually have 2 responses, although one was mine. So let me just pause for a minute, let folks go to that, just rfortherestofus.com/survey. Again, if you weren't on in the beginning, it will just, it'll redirect you to a Google form that will enable you to just give me a couple bits of data on your familiarity with R. Let me just pause for a second while I hopefully let folks do that. Actually do one thing in my report that'll code that will make this work. Okay. Yeah, so hopefully folks will give me a couple other bits of data to work with. I actually made a change right now to the code that'll make this work, even if that doesn't happen. So let me flip over to here. And I am going to do one thing. I'm going to run some code to render my report. So it's actually running right now. Uh-oh, it didn't work. Cool. So you can see right now, for example, right down here, what's happening is I have developed a kind of shell of a report, a template in R Markdown. So this is my R Markdown document, which I'll walk through in just a minute. And what I'm doing now is I'm downloading the data. So the data itself lives in a an Excel or a Google Sheet. So you can see here are actually all the responses that I've ever received when I've done this presentation in the past. You can see right now what's happening is it's actually geocoding these. And then in just a second, it's going to actually produce a report that I will pop up on the screen and we'll walk through it. Looks like we have one person who responded today who is in Orlando. Excellent. All right, so looks like this is just about done. So you can see in this folder, I've got a bunch of different reports. They're different ones depending on when they were done. All right, so this is going to be slightly artificial because what I ended up doing was I'm using data not just from today, but I'm actually using all the data that I've ever received on this. And I have now spit out this report. So about our respondents, it says we did a survey January 23rd, 2020, which is today. Got responses from 272 people. Again, that's all the responses I've ever received. Respondents listed their age. The youngest respondent was 0 years old, and the oldest respondent was 79. The mean age was 38. And the graph below shows the age of respondents broken into 3 groups, education level, and then it has their locations as well. So you can see there's an interactive map that shows, for example, when I've done this, I got someone in Saskatoon, looks like some folks in upstate New York, someone in New Freedom, I don't know if that was Maryland or Pennsylvania, folks all over the place. Now the cool thing is so this, again, it's a bit artificial today because I only have one response, but I could do this, I can generate this, when I've done this in the past, I've generated this report automatically based on the data that comes in that particular day. So I don't know, for example, when it says respondents listed their age, I don't know what the youngest respondent, someone apparently put 0, and I don't know what the age of the oldest respondent was. I'm calculating this dynamically, and I'll show you how in just a second. Let me just scroll down here. So you can see I have gender. This is where folks listed whatever gender they wanted to. So you can see the various options here. Now, these are going to, if you were to analyze these, things like, for example, female uppercase and female lowercase would show up differently. Also, for example, woman and female would not show up the same. So the gender coder package allows us to recode these. So for example, boy here gets recoded as male. Boy, male. You can see original response recoded. Some of them it's unable to recode. So for example, queer, unable to recode that. There are different options you can set in terms of how flexible you want it to be in terms of how it recodes or not. But you can see, for example, lowercase female is being recoded into uppercase female. And basically it allows us, again, to let people identify however they code it after the fact. So you can see, for example, transgender male here is recoded to transgender male. So female, cisgendered, it says unable to recode. Again, we could change the option so that it would perhaps do a better job of recoding them. You can see now then, we can summarize the recoded responses. And you can see the responses here. So we can get gender data here, but without actually forcing people to choose one of the options. I'm going to quickly scroll through this. I asked for folks for their familiarity. I did it by education level. And what it's actually doing here is it's using what's known as faceting, or making small multiples. So I did interest in learning R by education level and age. And I made one graph for bachelor's level, bachelor's degrees, one for master's, one for doctoral, and one for other. You can make these kind of small multiple graphs really easily in R. These are not actually 4 graphs. It's actually, it's one kind of code chunk that I then tell it make a separate graph for each education level. I'll show you in just a second. So let me just flip over here to my report. So this is my R Markdown document. I'm, again, not going to walk through every single detail, but you can see, for example, at the top, I'm setting kind of some options. I'm setting like the title, the type of output I want. So in this case, it was HTML document. That's the output that I wanted. Let me scroll back up to the top here. So you can see that's where the title shows up. This is what's called a code chunk, where again, I'm just setting some options. Not going to worry about the details for now. Then I'm loading packages that I'm going to use in this. The next code chunk, so you can see wherever there's this kind of gray background, that means it's a code chunk. What I'm doing is I'm setting the theme. So I'm setting the overall look and feel for all of my plots. You can see they all kind of look similar. Now what I'm doing here is I'm downloading my data. So again, I didn't know what the responses were going to be. I downloaded them automatically based on what folks put in the Google form. Then I had it actually filter so it would just show survey responses today. So what it's doing is it's reading in the CSV that I downloaded. Then it's doing a number of things so that it was actually filtering to only include responses from today. But I actually just deleted this line here, or I commented it out. So if you put a pound sign like that, it means don't run that line. And I did that so that it would actually use all of the data. Okay. So then I did a number of responses. So I'm calculating a number of things. So I have what's called a data frame, or a tibble here. And so when I do n row of survey responses today, it gives me this variable called number of responses, which if I scroll, where is that? Let me just run that. Number of responses here is 272. Don't worry about the L for right now. Then I'm dynamically calculating today's month, today's day, today's year, and then I'm making what's called today pretty. So I'm saying we did a survey on today pretty. So you can see here, this is text, but it's kind of a combination of text and R code. So it's saying we did a survey on today pretty. This shows up here as we did a survey on January 23rd, 2020. Today, that's because today pretty is, the value of it is here, as you can see, January 23rd, 2020. And the number of responses then shows up here, which again was 272, right? So that shows up dynamically here. Again, I'm calculating for age, I'm calculating mean age, max age, min age, and then I'm putting it in so it shows dynamically. All of the rest really follows kind of a similar pattern, where I'm calculating a number of things, and then I'm either writing text, or in this case, for example, this is ggplot code, so this is making a graph. So if, for example, if I just run that code, it produces that graph, which should look familiar to you here because it shows up right here. Again, the rest of it kind of follows the same pattern, so you can see I have some text here. If you're wondering why there are 2 pound signs here, education then becomes a header, a second level header, because there are 2 pound signs. And then it produces this graph. The overall point is that when you use R Markdown, you don't even necessarily need to know what the data is beforehand. You can produce reports dynamically. Or if you get into the situation where you're doing a survey and then all of a sudden you get 10 more responses, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to go back and do your analysis in SPSS, spit it back to Excel, then into Word. You just rerun your R Markdown document, reknit it, and spit it back out, in this case, to an HTML document or a Word document or a PDF or whatever format you want it to be in. All right, let me finish up by saying that despite the fact that I've given you a lot of really kind of concrete reasons to learn R, I think in many ways the best reason to learn R is the community. This is a tweet that went out last year, someone saying she was considering starting to learn R, and just take a look at the responses that she gets. The R community is amazingly supportive. I know I was really nervous when I started out, thinking I'm an anthropologist, I'm not a hardcore quant, am I going to be welcomed? Are people going to kind of make fun of me in this community? And I found the exact opposite. So if you're thinking about learning R, just know that you'll have that supportive community, which is really helpful. Let me see. Let me pause for just a second and check if there are any comments that have come in. I don't actually see any right this moment. So let me just finish off by saying, if you are interested in starting your R journey, I offer online courses. So I have a free Getting Started with R course, so to give you kind of the basics for how you set up R, how you import data, take a look at your data, etc. I have a fundamentals course, which goes beyond that, talks about R Markdown, data wrangling and analysis, as well as data visualization. And then I'm actually working on a new course now, going deeper with R, which does things, for example, like reshaping your data, getting it in the right format, really making high quality data visualization with R, etc. I also offer custom training for organizations if you're interested in that. 1, 2, or 3 day sessions usually, followed by project support, where I help folks work through particular issues that they have as they're making that transition to R. And there is all of my contact information, David at rfortherestofus.com, DG Kais on Twitter. And R for the Rest of Us is R for the Rest. I tweet on the R for the Rest account a lot of really, I think, helpful tips, really aimed at beginners. So if that fits you and you want to follow that, I think it would be really helpful. I know folks have told me that it is. So I'll wrap up for now. If there are any, let me just check if there are any other questions. I am delighted to talk R, and I would love to have you follow up with me. All right, thanks folks for joining. I appreciate it, and look forward to connecting with you. Take care.